Durantako bhavatu va brahma surendrotava bhanurva shashalakshanota bhagavan buddhota siddhota va ragadvesha visharati moharahita sattvanukampodyato Yasarvai saha samskrito gunaganais tasmai namah sarvada. The Supreme Reality and its messengers are known by various names in various traditions. But as for me, I offer my worship always to the one going by any name and belonging to any tradition, who is free from attachment and hatred, free from worldliness and delusion, who is filled with compassion towards all living beings, and who is possessed of all noble virtues. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning, the topic is God Among Us, and that's a translation of one of the names by which Jesus was known, Emmanuel. Emmanuel, which you've all heard, means God among us. In the Christian tradition, as in the Hindu tradition, there are various names for Christ, various names for Mary, various names for God. And as we have in the Hindu tradition, like the 1,000 names of Shiva, the 1,000 names of Lalita, 1,000 names of Vishnu. They don't have 1,000 names of Jesus, etc., but they do have what are called litanies. And litanies are very beautiful, and you find them in the Roman Catholic tradition. There's no reason why they should be limited to the Roman Catholic tradition. It's just that was the tradition in which they developed them. And it's the closest correspondence to like the 1,000 names of Vishnu, etc. So there'll be epithet after epithet of Jesus or of Mary or of the Trinity, etc. And so Emmanuel is one of the names mentioned in the Bible, in the New Testament, by which Jesus was known, God among us. And so the idea was, because of the Jewish tradition, where in the early Jewish tradition, God was put as completely separate from creation. Later in Judaism, there were higher ideas of a God within everything in creation also. But the early idea was that God is completely separate from creation. And the creator and creature are completely separate. So God among us was a way of saying that no, God is not just the creator far away from the creature, who creates the creature but is far away, but God among us. That is, Jesus is God taking birth and dwelling among us. So today I want to speak about Jesus, both from a Christian standpoint and from a Hindu standpoint, because both have something to tell us about Jesus. Our tradition, the Ramakrishna tradition, is somewhat unique. Not unique in Hinduism for respecting the other religions and other founders of religions. That is common in Hinduism. But somewhat unique in that we worship Jesus. As you know, even in India, at our centers, we have a Christmas Eve service in which Jesus is worshipped. And of course, in Western countries, the United States, European countries, South American countries, where the dominant population is Christian, then also, of course, we celebrate Christmas Eve. Again, that's not unique to Hinduism, but the reasons for which we worship, the fact that we actually worship Jesus, not just respect him or accept him as an incarnation of God, but actually worship him, keep a picture of him as well as a Buddha, is somewhat unique to the Ramakrishna tradition. With Christ in particular, it's because Sri Ramakrishna himself had the direct experience of Jesus. He had the direct mystical vision of Jesus. Looking at the picture of the Mother Mary and child, which is the picture that we'll worship here tomorrow night for Christmas Eve, the same print of the same picture that Sri Ramakrishna saw at Jadu Mallik's garden house. He saw this picture of Mary holding the baby Jesus, and he saw the picture come to life. Mary and the baby Jesus come to life. And then he went into a state of ecstasy for 3 days, in which he stopped going to the Hindu temples, to the Mother Kali's temple, to the Vishnu temple, Shiva temples, etc., and was just in a state of ecstasy thinking about, or not thinking about, but in a state of mystic communion with Jesus. During those 3 days, he saw in a vision the Christian Mass, the celebration of the Mass, and through his mystic vision, he understood the intent of it. If we had never heard about Jesus and never seen a Mass, and were to go into a Catholic church or an Eastern Orthodox church where a full Mass is done, the full ritual is done, and to see it, it might look pretty, it might look interesting, but we'd have no idea what was going on. But because Sri Ramakrishna saw it with his spiritual intelligence and saw it in a vision, the meaning itself was laid bare. That's one of the characteristics of a genuine spiritual vision, is that the meaning itself is expressed through the vision. And so he said to himself, or thought to himself when he saw this vision, yes, this too is a wonderful way of worshiping Jesus. So he saw the living Christ, he saw the living Mary, he saw the Christian worship. And at the end of the 3 days, when he was at near the Panchavati, he saw a figure walking towards him. And he recognized that this was a foreigner. But he saw this is not an ordinary person, this is a divine person, because of the look in his eyes. It said that only an illumined soul can recognize another illumined soul. And so Sri Ramakrishna recognized this person coming towards him as not an ordinary human being, but as a divine person. And the person coming towards him smiled and then entered right into him, merged into him. And then Sri Ramakrishna again went into a deep state of ecstasy, in a state of union with Jesus. But as this man walked towards him, he heard the words, "This is Jesus the Christ, whose blood was shed for humanity," etc. And so he knew, as Jesus came closer to him, he knew that it was Jesus, and then Jesus merged into his being. And so because of that identity that Sri Ramakrishna experienced with Jesus, Christmas Eve has a special significance to us. The person of Jesus has a personal significance, a special significance to us also. But also it was on Christmas Eve in 1886. Sri Ramakrishna passed away in August 1886, and several months later, in December 24th, the monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna gathered at Swami Premananda's ancestral home in Anantapur in West Bengal. And that evening they built a dhuni fire and were sitting around the dhuni fire, as sadhus do. And Swami Vivekananda, who still was Narendranath, he read to them from the New Testament, read the story about Christ, and discussed Christ with them. And inspired by the spirit of renunciation seen in the life of Christ, they decided then and there that we will renounce hearth and home and become sannyasis. And it was only later that they discovered that that was Christmas Eve. They didn't know it at the time, but later they discovered it was Christmas Eve when they made that decision. So for all of these reasons, there's a special significance. Now let me say something that I often say, I have several times said here, and that is that some people, some Hindus object and say that, oh, the Ramakrishna people, they're not true Hindus because they keep a picture of Christ, they keep a picture of Buddha, that they're not true Hindus. No, those people who say that are not true Hindus. They are the people who are not true Hindus because they don't know their own tradition. The Hindu tradition is ready to respect holiness wherever it is seen, and that goes back to Vedic times. And so anyone who says that, oh, they're not true Hindus because they have a picture of Christ and Buddha, they don't know what they're talking about. And so we don't need to be defensive about that, because that is in the true spirit of Hinduism. And there's an incident that I've told before. When I was in Mayavati, there was a Christian monk, a Roman Catholic monk, who was coming to India, whom I had known in America. I was living in Mayavati at that time, and I heard he was coming, so I wrote to him and said, oh, please come to see our ashram up in the Himalayas. You would like it very much. It's a contemplative ashram, and I would like to show it to you. So he agreed, and he came up to Mayavati on his trip. And I had told the local villagers that a Christian sadhu was coming, and so they knew at least that Christianity was the religion of the Englishman. It wasn't their religion. And so one day I was showing Father Basil around and taking him for a walk through the forest. And on the forest trail, there were a group of villagers coming towards us. And so when they saw us, they put down their implements and they went over to Father Basil to touch his feet in the North Indian style, like so. And Father Basil said, turned to me and said, tell them that I'm not one of them, I'm not one of them. So I said, no, Father Basil, that doesn't matter at all to them. They already know that you're a Christian, Father, but it's because you're a holy man. That's all that matters to them. And so these were simple villagers. These were not cosmopolitan people or people who had decided that all religions are true because they had studied comparative religions in college or something. No, these were simple, uneducated villagers who spontaneously did that. No one told them. I had never told them to do that. They spontaneously did it, knowing that he was a Christian, not a Hindu, but also knowing that he was a holy man, that he was a sadhu. And that was enough for them to go and pay their respects. So that's the Hindu tradition that we should be proud of and that we should celebrate. There are those also who get terribly upset nowadays that Hindus in America or in Europe in particular are sometimes send Christmas cards. That's not Hindu, that's not Hindu, don't send Christmas cards. Well, no, you don't have to send Christmas cards to anybody as a Hindu, but if you want to, what is contrary to Hinduism in sending a Christmas card to someone? To make that a point of identity, that we are the people who do not send Christmas cards. That's absurd. If you don't want to send Christmas cards, don't send them. But don't make that a point of your identity. The point of your identity is that we recognize holiness wherever it is, spirituality wherever it is. And Hinduism is strong enough that we need not fear losing our identity. That's part of our identity, to recognize spirituality wherever we find it. Some people have told me that, yes, but Christians don't reciprocate, and they should be made to understand. Well, no, who are we to make them understand? We do it because that's our principle, that's what we stand on, and in the long run, that will win out. You don't win out by saying, well, you won't do it to us, well, we will not do it to you. No. What kind of foolishness is that? That's not a principle to stand on. That's just succumbing to equal narrowness. We should celebrate the fact that we do it and are big enough to do it. Some people, even some of our swamis, get upset that in India, some of the Christian padres in India, they wear Geruva cloth and wear Rudraksha beads and things. They say, oh, they're doing it just to fool people, to make them think that they're Hindu, and then they'll turn them into Christians. Well, I'm not in favor of conversion. I don't like that at all. And much trickery has been used and is still used today in India to convert people away from Hinduism. That I don't at all support. I'm totally opposed to it. But in the long run, what you will see happening is that even those, not all of them do it in order to trick people. I know some who do it out of sincerity, out of an identity with the Christian tradition, but admittedly, some do it to trick people. But in the long run, what will happen? If they wear Geruva, in the long run, people will see, when they wear Geruva, these people wear Geruva, then the tendency will be to be absorbed into the larger body of Hinduism. If they chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, which some of them do, then yes, in order to sound like Hare Krishna, but substituting Christ's name. But in the long run, if people do that, then they'll say, Krishna, Krishna, what's the difference? If I say Hare Krishna and I say Hare Krishna, what's the difference? He's great also. So the long run tendency, whatever the motivation, will be to break down barriers, and so that we need not worry. Also, as I've said before here, I read a book many years ago, back in the early 1970s, around 1970, 71, something like that, when I was a new brahmachari in the Michigan ashram. I read a book called Hinduism Invades India, and it was a wonderful book, though the whole thing was against Hinduism. It was wonderful, contrary to the intention of the author, because the author was a Christian missionary, and he said that the greatest danger to Christianity today is Hinduism. It's not atheism, it's not communism, it's not any Buddhism or anything else. The greatest danger is Hinduism. Why? Because we tell the Hindus about the Trinity, and they say, oh yes, that's fine, we accept that. We have so many gods, we can accept the Trinity, that's no problem. Another way to look at God. We present Christ to them as the Son of God. They say, oh yes, wonderful, wonderful. We also accept Christ as the Son of God. We have Krishna, we have Rama, we have Sri Chaitanya, we have Ramakrishna. Why not to Jesus? We'll add him also. And so whatever we tell them, they say, oh yes, that's wonderful. We'll add that into ours also. And so the danger to Christianity, this man wrote, is that Hinduism will gradually absorb Christianity, and there'll be nothing distinct left about Christianity. That was one of the greatest testaments to Hinduism I've ever read, that is the power of Hinduism, to absorb, to accept, to expand, to accept. As Swami Vivekananda used to say, Indian society, the social system in India was exclusive, but religion was inclusive. Religion was free, religion was broad and inclusive. And that's the great strength of Hinduism. So that we, because of the idea of the Ishta Devata, the chosen ideal, that everyone has their own way of looking at God. So Christ, Allah, Buddha, all of those are, from the Hindu standpoint, are valid chosen ideals, valid ways of looking at God. You need not choose any of them, you can choose your own. But they also are valid ways of seeing God. My own conviction is that in time, that the walls between religion will begin to crumble. And that started with Sri Ramakrishna, with his expansive vision, and with the merging of Jesus in him, with the merging of himself with Allah, and his accepting of all different traditions, that they all were absorbed into him. Not that everyone will become a worshipper of Sri Ramakrishna, no, many people will, but there'll always be room for other chosen ideals. But the sense that religions are exclusive, that we are like this and we are like that, and we don't do that and we don't do that. No, those ridiculous divisions among religions will begin to disappear. Swami Vivekananda said that we Hindus, we Vedantists, can accept the Bible and the Quran as Puranas. And indeed they are Puranas. They fit all of the definition of a Purana. A Purana tells about creation. That's what the Bible and the Quran tell about. The Purana tells about lineage of kings and sages. That's what the Quran and the Bible tell about. Purana tells about history. That's where the name Purana comes from, that which is old, which tells about old things. That's what the Bible and the Quran do. And so Swami Vivekananda said we can accept the Bible and the Quran also as Puranas. And so again, that tremendous absorbing power of Hinduism, which at the time of Shankaracharya, who at that time living could have dreamed that Buddhism would be absorbed back into Hinduism? Who could have dreamed it? Buddhism was ascendant. Buddhism was ruling the country. It was the strong tradition. and Hinduism was in a weakened state. Who at that time could have imagined? But starting with Shankaracharya, with the revival of Hinduism, within another 600 years, then Buddhism had been absorbed into Hinduism. It wasn't that Buddhism was driven out of India. People have told me, even some of our swamis have said, well, Buddhism was driven out. What do you mean it was driven out? Who drove who out? Where did the people run to? Who were the people who ran? Nobody ran. Nobody was chased. It wasn't run out of India. It was absorbed into Hinduism in an organic, peaceful way. There was no violence involved. There was no chasing of anybody, and so it was absorbed into Hinduism. So again, that's the strength of Hinduism. But there is a danger. In Hinduism we say that all religions are true. But then many of us say that all religions are the same. No, all religions are not the same. They're all true, but they're all true because they lead to the same unnameable, indescribable reality, God. But they do it in their own individual way. And so to say that, oh, they're all the same, no, that's not true. We have to recognize the differences and respect the differences as well. The similarities and differences both are important. Once I was with Swami Bhashyanandaji when I was a new brahmachari, and we had gone to see some professors who were gathered with other people to hear the Swami's talk in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And the Swami said that we accept all religions. And one of the professors said, yes, but that's not right, Swami. The religions are different. They're different. That's why they're called by different names. The religions are all different. And Swamiji said, you in the West focus on differences. We in India focus on similarities. And so that's true. And that's the strength of Hinduism, to focus on similarities. And to see similarities and points of commonality, and to see that they're all pointing at the same thing. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the differences are the differences between paths. They're going in the same direction, but as paths, they are different. So let me talk some now about Jesus and some of the great major themes in his life, which are important. One of the principal themes, and which no one would contradict, is love. Love was the major theme in Jesus' life. Love for God and love for man also. That you see throughout Jesus' life. That in what the Christians call Old Testament, or what the Jews call the Torah, that God was often judgmental and God was often angry and so forth. But you find with Jesus a completely different interpretation, that God was seen as love. And in the third epistle of St. John in the New Testament, one of the disciples of Christ, St. John, he says several times in his third epistle that God is love. God is love. That's the nature of God. And that's an extremely important statement. One of my teachers, a Hindu teacher, a Swami of our order, who still has never been outside of India, but he used to tell me that that's a fifth Mahavakya. Mahavakyas are the great statements of the Upanishads, and there are 4 Mahavakyas. Tattvamasi, the most famous, thou art that. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. Ayam Atma Brahma, this self is Brahman. And Prajnanam Brahma, consciousness is Brahman. So they're called Mahavakyas, or great sayings, because they encapsulate the essential truths of the Upanishads, the most essential truths. And they also are called Mahavakyas because they point to something in your direct experience, something you're experiencing right now, and saying, this that you experience, that is Brahman. Just know it for what it is. Tattvamasi, you are Brahman. Know who you are and you know what Brahman is. I am aham brahmasmi. I am Brahman. If I know who aham is, I am, then I know Brahman. I am Atma Brahma. This very self is Brahman. And I know myself, but I don't really know it fully. Know it fully and you've known the whole truth of the universe. Prajnanam Brahma. Consciousness is Brahman. Know consciousness and you've known Brahman. So it points to something experience. So the Swami used to tell me that God is love is similarly a Mahavakya, a great saying, because it points to something in your direct experience, love. Everyone has some experience of love, but we don't know pure absolute love. Know that, know what true love is, the love you have in your own heart. Go into that, examine that, clarify it, purify it, and you'll find that that is God. So something within your direct experience. So Christ taught love for God and love for man. I'll come back to that in a few moments. A second idea which is at the center of Christ's life is the idea of sacrifice. The idea of sacrifice. That's at the very heart of Christ's life. Not just his crucifixion, but his whole life. And so sacrifice was an expression of love for man and love for God. So renunciation, which is, Christ's life was full of renunciation. It was an example of renunciation. That's why the direct disciples of Ramakrishna, with Narendra at their head, reading the life of Christ in Anpur in December 1886, they were so inspired with renunciation, they decided then and there to renounce the world. So renunciation is an expression of sacrifice for the sake of God, giving up everything for the sake of God. So a monastic does it one way, a householder does it another way, but eventually if we want to go to God, we have to forget everything else and focus on God, one way or another. So Jesus taught a religion of renunciation, not a religion of enjoyment. Christ's teachings have been followed in the West for 2,000 years, but gradually his teachings on renunciation were de-emphasized so that people could have a comfortable life. If you always tell people about renunciation, 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 then people get sick of it. so forget about it. So the renunciation that's in every word of Christ, that was played down. But Christ said, like the foxes have their holes and the birds of the air have their nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. That is, he has no home of his own. Even the foxes and the birds have their homes, but the Son of Man, meaning himself, has no home. He said, take no thought of the morrow. That God has provided for the birds and the animals. Will he not take care of you? So take no thought for the morrow. Again, a statement of renunciation. You cannot worship both God and mammon, he says in the Sermon on the Mount. Again, renunciation. So again and again, you can save your life only by losing your life. So again and again, that message of renunciation. Give away all that you have to the poor, take up your cross and follow me. Again, renunciation. So everywhere, that idea of renunciation for the sake of God. And then renunciation for the sake of man, or humanity. That sacrificing everything out of love for humanity is also what he taught. Why do priests and nuns and pastors, religious pastors and ministers, sacrificing a comfortable life here, go into distant places, remote places, and spend their whole lives there? Now, yes, it may be with a narrow idea, the narrow idea that I have to save them, I have to save souls, I have to go and give them the message of Christ and save their souls. Yes, I don't agree with that philosophical idea or theological idea. But you have to recognize the greatness of people that can go and sacrifice everything. Even our swamis in Cherrapunji, who have been their work has been much damaged by the Christian missionaries, and even one of our swamis whom I know, they tried to kill him. They put a bomb in his room and tried to kill him, and he luckily was not there when the bomb went off, because he had been warned by the president of our order, Swami Vireshwarananji. But in spite of all of those incidents, our Swamis in Cherrapunji say that it's remarkable that these Christian missionaries come, leaving everywhere, go and live their whole lives in remote jungles without any pleasures, without any of their own society, without any of their own people. So yes, it may be with a narrow idea of conversion, but still it's with the wonderful idea of dedication and of sacrifice. So they may have a narrow idea about why they're doing it, but they have a heart broad enough and dedicated enough to go and actually do that. And so why do people go into remote areas? Aside from the narrow idea of conversion, there is another idea, and that Christ himself said, it's recorded in Matthew, the book of St. Matthew, Christ speaking, I was hungry and you fed me, thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you received me in your homes, naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you took care of me, in prison and you visited me. The righteous, then Christ says, the righteous will then say, when, Lord, did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we ever see you a stranger and welcome you in our homes, or naked and clothe you? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you? I will reply, I tell you, whenever you did this for one of the least important of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. So that idea, that you do it for the least of humanity, then you have done it for me. The Vedantic idea is because Christ, as God, is within everyone. And so what you do for the least person, you're doing it for Christ. Or you're doing it for Ramakrishna. Or you're doing it for the Divine Mother. It doesn't matter what your chosen ideal is, but you're doing it for the divine. And so that's a wonderful idea. And so it was out of that idea that the idea of service, that is sacrifice of everything for the love of humanity, because within humanity is God. So they may not have the philosophy to explain it the way that we explain it, but that's the same idea that Swami Vivekananda taught on a very broad basis. Not tied to one chosen ideal, Ishtadevata, not tied to one religion or one idea of religion, but just the divine within everyone. He said, why do you need to build temples and images when here before you is the living God? Bow down and worship the living God. Serve the living God. He told Sister Nivedita, in your school, teach the young girls to go out and bring beggars into the school once a week, to worship them, to feed them, to give them new cloth, etc. That great things will come out of this, the spirit of service of the God in man. So love, sacrifice. Another idea that you see in Christ's life, exemplified in Christ's life very beautifully, is the spiritual value of suffering. That yes, in Christianity sometimes that was overdone. There was an overemphasis on suffering and glorifying suffering. But the idea as presented by Christ is wonderful and beautiful. Until the time of Christ, in religions around the world, suffering was that which we were to avoid, that which we were to rise above. Buddha said that life is suffering. Worldly existence is suffering. So follow this path to transcend suffering. And yes, that's good. In Hinduism, the idea was to transcend suffering. But Jesus said that, yes, suffering itself has its own spiritual value. The thing is that suffering is not an end in itself, but it has a transformative value. That was recognized in the Vedas and in the Upanishads also, but Jesus made a point of it. In the Chandogya Upanishad it says that if you are ill, make illness your tapasya. If you are ill, make illness your tapasya. That's a wonderful idea, a wonderful idea. So Christ broadened that concept and said that all suffering has the value of purification. That if you accept suffering properly, that all suffering has the value of purifying the mind and heart. It has the value of expanding your heart in sympathy for others. How many of us have found that after an episode of suffering, Then we could look on others with sympathy and see that, yes, now I know what that means. I've been through that myself. And so my heart goes out to you when I see you going through it as well. So that also is exemplified in the life of Christ. And then something which is largely ignored in modern Christianity is the experiential element of religion, which to Hinduism is the most important part of religion altogether. It's the essence of religion, it's the direct experience of God. Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." For they shall see God. And he says the same thing in other words several times through the Bible, like the kingdom of heaven is among you or within you. It's not it's not here, it's not there, but the kingdom of heaven is within you. Be ye therefore perfect, even as the Father in heaven is perfect. And so he points to this experiential element over and over again. But in the Sermon on the Mount, he says it most clearly. So clearly that Swami Vivekananda said to a Western audience, in Hinduism there are plenty of such examples, but because he was speaking to a Western audience that was mostly Christian, he said that even if all of the scriptures and all of the prophets were to disappear from the world, all religious traditions were to disappear, but that one statement were left, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," then religion and spirituality would survive. That the essence of religion is there. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. That's the essence of religion. And yet again, in so much of Christianity, that itself is ignored. In fact, once, not by everyone, but by in the large scale, yes. Once I was when I was living in San Diego, I was part of a Soviet festival in San Diego in 1989, before the breakup of the Soviet Union, but during Glasnost and Perestroika, when the Soviet Union was opening up, and Gorbachev was the premier, and he was trying to open the Soviet Union to the world. So in San Diego, they celebrated I can never remember whether it was 1 week or 2 weeks, but it must have been 2 weeks, Soviet festival, which was put on jointly by the city of San Diego and the government of the USSR, in which artists of all types, the best artists of all types from Russia, were brought to San Diego, and for 2 weeks there was a festival of the arts. There was ballet, there was orchestra, there was vocal music, choral music, there were visual artists, all type of dance, all types of the arts from the Soviet Union were brought and celebrated there. And at the end of it, there was a interreligious prayer service, which I was invited to be the representative for Hinduism. And so each tradition had a certain amount of time, and you could do what you wanted to do. You could sing, you could chant, you could read, whatever you wanted to do to present a message from your tradition as you would want it presented. And so I remember that there was, because Christianity, of course, was the dominant religion in San Diego, there were not just one representative, as there were for like the Buddhists and the Hindus, etc., but there were the the Protestants, the Roman Catholics, the Russian Orthodox, etc., the evangelicals. And so there was an evangelical minister who stood up for his part in the ceremony, and he began to read the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, etc. And so he was reading all of these in a grand style. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall inherit the earth. Or that's the meek, but for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, etc. Blessed are these, blessed are those. And then suddenly he came to, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And then he goes to the next blessed. But this one, it was like an embarrassment to him. Everything else was blessed these, then blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And then blessed are the next ones. That which was, to us, was the most important of all of the Beatitudes, was taken as somehow an embarrassment and just glossed over. But it's there in Christ. It's there in the teachings of Jesus, the experiential element. So every great teacher gives something which is new, at least a new emphasis to something in the harmony of religions. And so there are several new things, and I've already touched on them, new things that we see in the message of Jesus, that we see with Rama, we see with Krishna, we see with the Buddha, and we see with Jesus also, as now we see with Ramakrishna and the Holy Mother and Swami Vivekananda, each of them contributing something new. So one of the things that was new in the teachings of Christ was God's love for man. In religion before that, it had been taught that we are to love God, and that our relationship to God is one of love, and we should love God. But the emphasis that God loves man, that was not emphasized prior to the coming of Christ. But the teachings of Christ, you see with the story of the prodigal child, the prodigal son, who had left his father and gone off and spent his inheritance, wasted his inheritance, and then he comes back having led a sinful life for many years, ignoring his family. He comes back, and the father is so happy and welcomes him back, and tells his other son to go and kill the fatted calf so that we can feed him the best that we have and feast him. And so the son says, "But father, the whole time I was here with you, I did everything that you said. And this worthless son of yours, he ran away, made you miserable for years, wasted his inheritance and everything, and now you're celebrating. How could this be?" And the father said, "Yes, but he was lost, and now he has returned. And he was lost, and now he's been found. And so it's a time for celebration." So that was said to be, that Christ said, that was a analogy to the love of God for humanity. And yes, we may forget God for lifetimes after lifetimes, but when we return, it's a moment of celebration in the heart of God. And we see the same thing in the life of Ramakrishna and Holy Mother. After Sri Ramakrishna had passed away, Holy Mother, one day, one evening, she went into deep state of ecstasy. And when she began to come back after a long time, began to come back to some awareness of her personal being, she wasn't yet aware of her surroundings, but she was beginning to come back to her personal being, Sarada Devi being, rather than the Divine Mother being. She said, as if talking to herself, not yet aware that a few devotees, women devotees, were seated around her. She said, "No one knows how it is that Sri Ramakrishna suffers, how much Sri Ramakrishna suffers. It's seated within the hearts of all, waiting for people to turn their minds towards him. And yet how few do, how few do." And then she said, for Sri Ramakrishna, there is no liberation. He comes again and again, waiting for humanity to turn their attention towards him, meaning towards God, and yet how few do. So that same idea of God's love for man, Sri Ramakrishna said that sometimes God is the lotus and the devotee is the bee, enjoying the honey in the lotus. But sometimes the devotee is the lotus and God is the bee who sips the nectar in the devotee's heart. So again, that idea which we find first clearly expressed in the life of Christ. And then we find that another message that was there in Christ, which is connected, is that the love of man is not contradictory to the love of God. That previously the idea was that you forget everything here and you seek God by forgetting all of this. But Jesus said, no, true love for other human beings is not contrary to the love of God, because of the presence of God within everyone, as that statement I read of Christ's a few moments ago so clearly elucidates. That also is similar to Swami Vivekananda's teachings and Holy Mother's whole life, that love for humanity, true love for humanity, is not contrary to love of God. And then again, another thing that was revealed beautifully in Christ's life, a special contribution of Christ, was love for the poor and vulnerable. Love for the poor, special love. Love for everyone, but special love for the poor and vulnerable. That they are especially to be loved. And that also you see so much in Swami Vivekananda's life. And then, as I said, the spiritual value of suffering. That yes, suffering is to be transcended. But along the way, suffering has its value. And that value is to be utilized. If we spend our lives trying to run from suffering, we find that suffering runs much faster than we do. We can't get away from it. Suffering will always catch up to us. But if we stop and turn around and saying, come joy, come suffering, come happiness, come suffering, it doesn't matter, I am equal to both, I accept both of you, then we find that both of them can ennoble us, both of us can transform us, both of them can take us forward. And as Swami Vivekananda said, that we'll find that suffering has more value in life than the happy times in life. That we find that suffering has formed our character more than the good times. So again, that doesn't mean go out and look for suffering, or to try to suffer, or to hope that you suffer for eternity. No, but it means that when suffering comes, accept it and use it to grow. So what we find missing in Christ's life, it certainly was there in Christ's life, but what is missing from the record of Christ's life? One thing is humor. The record of Christ's life is extremely serious, and so serious that the tradition in the West, the religious tradition in the West, is that religious people should not smile or laugh too much. That you should always be somewhat sour and sad. That religious people are a sorrowful lot. So Swami Vivekananda was often told by others that Swamiji, you are a man of the cloth, meaning a minister. You're a man of the cloth. Should you be joking and laughing so much? And Swamiji was completely confused by that statement. He said, what a ridiculous statement. God is joy, and those who belong to God are joyful, even in the midst of possible suffering, which Swamiji had plenty of suffering. But they're joyful by nature. So humor must have been there in the life of Christ also. In fact, one of my friends who just passed away, a great man, a great Christian monk, Father Thomas Keating, a very famous, world-famous Christian monk who just died a couple of months or so ago, a very great man that I was privileged to work with for many years. He used to say that certainly Christ must have been humorous, as all great spiritual people are. It wasn't recorded, but he said that calling Peter, his disciple Peter, the rock on which he would found his church, that he said that itself should be taken as a joke, because Peter was the most unstable of all of the disciples. And then another thing which is missing in the New Testament, but certainly was there, it just wasn't recorded, was spiritual practice. Again, from Christ's 12th year until he begins his ministry, it's a blank. We don't know what happened in that time, but all of that time must have been preparation for his mission, and time of spiritual practice. But that's not recorded, unfortunately. So there's Christ, and then there's Christianity. And so now let me spend a few moments just speaking about what makes Christianity different in tone from Hinduism. Again, not different in the sense of contradictory, or not different in the sense of one is right and one is wrong, but different in the sense of the tone, the nature of the path. One of the things, of course, one of the influences prime influences on Christianity was the Jewish context. It grew. Christ was a Jew himself, and the tradition grew out of Judaism. The disciples were Jewish. Christ's mother was Jewish. The people he preached to were largely, not exclusively, but largely Jewish. And so one of the things that is peculiar to Judaism was the idea that our God is the true God and all other gods are false. That was contrary to the teaching around the world, and not just in Hinduism, but the Greeks, the Romans, the Native Americans, people around the world had the idea that different people have their own religious paths, but that they're basically their own way of following religion. That religion is one. The Vedic idea was that religion is one and people do it in different ways. Then Swami Vivekananda used to say that the idea of different religions first came into India with the Buddhists, because the Buddhists said, we're not like you. We are different. They defined themselves outside of the religious context they were born in, that Buddha was born in. They defined themselves as outside and said, we are separate. And so that was the first arising of the idea of different religions in India. Before that, there were ideas that people did religion in different ways, but religion was one. So Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda came to reestablish that Vedic idea of religion, that religion is one, and people do it in different ways. That's okay. But the thing itself is one. The religious impulse is one, and the religious goal is one. That idea that there's our God is the true God and all other gods are false, that was absorbed, unfortunately, into Christianity and into Islam, so that they became exclusive, that our idea of God is the true idea and all other ideas are wrong. There's no need for that. There's no need for that. It was a historical remnant of Judaism which entered into Christianity. Christ himself said, yes, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. Yes, that's true. But as Swami Vivekananda showed, there is another way to interpret that. That it's only through the incarnation that we can see the nature of God. That otherwise God is transcendent. It's through the Son that we see the Father. Sri Krishna said similar things in the Gita, but the Hindus interpreted it in a broad basis. The Christians, unfortunately, took it in a narrow way. So the statement is true. Christ's statement is true, but the interpretation needs to be broad, not narrow. When the ancient Greeks came in contact with Indian civilization through Alexander, Greeks wrote back to Greece saying that here we find that the one we worship as Hercules, they worship here as Krishna. The one we worship as Zeus, they worship here as Shiva. So the idea of seeing similarity, that was the ancient way of seeing, and that we should go back to. So there was the Jewish influence, there was the influence of St. Paul. St. Paul who was Jewish himself, but he gave a special influence to Christianity. He was a great mystic. St. Paul was a very great mystic, a man of great spiritual illumination. But he was the one who introduced the idea of original sin. Christ never mentions original sin. That was introduced by St. Paul. Why? Because he realized the soul. He was absorbed in that light on the road to Damascus for 3 days and nights, where he was aware of nothing else, but absorbed in the ocean of light. And so he saw the glory of the soul. And he talks about that in his own figurative language, symbolic language. But he saw that there was a stain on the soul. And so where did that stain come from? The stain which keeps us from knowing our own, the glory of the soul and the purity of the soul. Where did that stain come from? So he didn't have a philosophy to explain it. There was not a philosophy handy to him at that time to explain it. But there was a myth, the Jewish story of the fall of Adam and Eve. And so he said that, this must be the stain of original sin. It's because Adam and Eve were created perfect, but they sinned against God, and therefore the curse of that sin has stained the soul ever since. And it's only through Christ that stain can be washed away. Because he found, by discovering Christ in a vision, he never saw the living Christ, or the human Christ, that is. He saw the spiritual Christ, and it was through that he went beyond the stain of original sin. So he formulated the doctrine of original sin. So that also was based on experience, but it became hardened into a dogma which was used to explain the nature of humanity. And then a third influence on the foundations of Christianity were the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, and the early Christians were fighting against the Roman Empire. And so there was a great value put on martyrdom, because you could be martyred at any time for your faith. And so martyrdom became a great value. And again, Christianity began to define itself by fighting against heathen forces. And so that is something that continues down to the present day. That's why all of us here are heathens, to be pitied. Not by liberal Christians, by those who are narrow. We're all heathen because they're still fighting against heathens. That's why they swept through Europe, killing all who would not convert, and through other countries also. That influence of the Roman Empire, and then another influence of the Roman Empire was once Constantine accepted Christianity, became a Christian, then Christianity became the religion of the empire. And so the Roman Empire continues to live, really, the mechanisms of the Roman Empire continues to live in the Roman Catholic Church. To some extent in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but in the Eastern Orthodox Church they didn't emphasize organization so much. But Rome, the great power of Rome was in organization. Rome invented modern organization. And so that also had a great influence on Christianity. And then finally, let me mention, there are other influences also I can mention, but another very important influence on the formation of Christianity, which we can't understand Christianity as a tradition without knowing this, is the awakening in the West to classical thought. And that came through the Muslims. The Muslims, it was the Muslims who preserved the learning of ancient Greece, Greece and Rome. In the Dark Ages in Europe, when all of that had been forgotten. It was a really cataclysmic time in Western civilization, when civilization practically was destroyed. And it was the Muslims who took up the Greek and Roman learning, preserved it, and then it was from them that the Europeans got it back. And so the Renaissance, that you all know of, the great Renaissance, the period of awakening of the European mind once again, was awakened because of the coming of classical thought, Greek and Roman thought. And so it was that awakened the European mind. It's that which led to modern science. It's that which led to ideas of new government, of democracy, and so forth. And so all of these influences on Christianity are important for understanding it. So now let me just, there are many other things I could say on the topic and would like to say, but that will have to wait for another time. Let me say what Christianity could learn from Vedanta, and has in a way. There are many Catholic priests and nuns and monks, Protestant ministers, Jewish rabbis who have been members of our Vedanta societies, not here in Houston yet, but in many of our societies, many have been. And so one of the things that could be learned, and these ministers and rabbis did learn it, was first of all a fearlessness of truth. There's a theological timidity in Christianity, where there's a fear of certain things, like in the Gospel of St. John, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." A profound statement, a wonderful statement. But that was never really looked into because it was afraid, the theologians were afraid that this would lead to pantheism, that is, saying that everything is God. So that fear of pantheism prevented them from looking into many lines of theological inquiry, which would be very rich for Christianity. So that fearlessness of truth is something which is needed. Another thing is that the purpose for religion is experience of God. The purpose of religion is experience of God. That has been there in Christianity in the past, but for several centuries that's been largely lost. The very purpose of religion is the experience of God, to take us to the experience of God. If that were revived, if that were seen within Christianity, because it's there in Christ, it's there. But if that were once again revived, that were understood, then that would get rid of the problems of the narrowness, the going around trying to convert people, trying to force people into your tradition, etc. That's all that it would take, is recognizing that religion is a matter of experience. That's an extremely important idea. In fact, people have criticized Sri Ramakrishna's experience of Christ and said, no, he didn't experience Christianity. To experience Christianity, you have to be a member of a church, you have to go to communion, you have to commune with other members of the church, and all of these things. That's what being a Christian means. Means participating in Christian life, the life of the church and so forth. Oh no, Sri Ramakrishna showed what the essence of being a Christian is, and that is the direct perception of Christ. Direct identity with Christ. That's what the essence of being a Christian is. And so Sri Ramakrishna showed what the essence of being a Christian is. And then the breadth of Hinduism would be of great value to Hinduism. The breadth, the ability to see similarity, the ability to see points of commonality and so forth. That instead of the fear of other traditions, that fear which comes from the early experience of the persecuted Christians, that heathens are to be avoided, we have to be afraid of the devil, afraid of heathens because they'll carry the devil to us and so forth. No, let that fear go. Recognize that we can embrace all of humanity, and embrace all of diversity. There's nothing to be afraid of. And then spiritual practice. Father Basil Pennington, the one who came to Mayavati and that the villagers bowed down to, that I mentioned earlier today. He, the first time I met him, which was, he came to our Ganges, Michigan monastery when I was living there as a new brahmachari. So I got to know him at that time. He told me that, he said that, you know, since the time of the Counter-Reformation, which came after Martin Luther brought about the Reformation in Christianity, and then the Catholic Church had the Counter-Reformation to counter the influence of the Lutherans and other Protestants. So he said, from the time of the Counter-Reformation, we lost our spiritual traditions. We lost our forms of meditation and mystical prayer and everything because the church became afraid of inner experience, because Martin Luther claimed to have inner authority to go against the church. And so the church became afraid of that. And so all of our mystical traditions were practically lost. So now we have to go to the East to recover spiritual traditions. So he told me at that time, now none of them will admit it, but he told me at that time, we're developing a new form of prayer called centering prayer. And for that, we've had to go to the Hindu tradition to learn forms of meditation. We're studying different forms of Hindu meditation, and that we are making Christianized in the form of centering prayer. So now if you study centering prayer, which is a very good tradition, it's a wonderful tradition, and it's spread around the world, it's very successful. And Father Thomas Keating that I mentioned, he and Father Basil Pennington and William Mininger, I forget his last name, Father William, they were the three who founded the centering prayer tradition. Now they say that it's based on the Cloud of Unknowing and other ancient Christian texts, and it's true, you can find it based in that. But they found it by going first back to the East and learning meditation there, and then finding a way to indigenize it, that is, to make it Christian. And so that also would be a great help to Christianity. One last thing is that I'll mention that Christianity could learn from Vedanta is transcendence. Because in Christianity, there's the idea that you will always remain a sinner. Forgiven by God, yes, forgiven by God, but you'll always be a sinner. And so you always need to be under the authority of the church. There's not the idea of complete transcendence where you become identified with God. And then your words themselves become Veda. That a person who is identified with God in spiritual experience, himself or herself becomes a source of Veda. So now what can we learn from Christianity? Because we can learn from Christianity. We can learn from everybody. That's why Swami Vivekananda said that we can accept the prophets of all religions, and we can accept the Bible, the Quran, as among our Puranas. And we should never be afraid to learn. That's one of the great teachings of Hinduism, is that we need not be afraid to learn, that knowledge itself is sacred. Knowledge itself is sacred. And look at Sri Ramakrishna, who always wanted to see how other people worship God, how other people follow the path to God. Not only to see it from outside, he wanted to go inside and to experience from the inside. So the new things that I mentioned as that came from Christ, those we can add to the common human heritage of spiritual heritage from the great teachers, the great incarnations of God and sages, that we inherit that also. Just as Hindu wisdom has been spread over the world for thousands of years without people recognizing it, but the wisdom is there, and it continues to be there without copyrighting it, without trademarking it, etc. So we can take, truth is universal. And so a religious tradition can't copyright truth. Just as gravitation was discovered by Newton in England, but it doesn't make gravitation English, and it doesn't make it copyrighted by Newton and his family or heirs. It's universal, and so truth is universal. So you can learn those things I mentioned that were taught by Christ. One of my teachers told me that it's good to read every day from the life of a saint, because it will give you encouragement. But he said especially the lives of Christian saints and Sufi saints. Why? Because in the Christian saints and Sufi saints, you see their struggles. They weren't afraid to show that they struggled, and that were the Hindu saints, they're presented as having been born on a lotus and never having had any struggle. That they were perfect from the beginning, knew everything from the beginning, they never had to struggle. But Christian saints and Sufi saints, you see, no, they went through struggles, and we can learn from that. Prayer. Sri Ramakrishna was a modern exponent of prayer. Over and over again, he says, pray to God with a yearning heart. Pray to God with a yearning heart. Each tradition has emphasized some set of spiritual practices. Christianity emphasized prayer. And so we can learn a lot about prayer by studying prayer as taught by the Christian mystics. Just as we can learn a lot about mindfulness by studying the Buddhist teachers. So prayer is there in Hinduism, mindfulness is there in Hinduism. But Christians, that was their main discipline, so they focused on it. Mindfulness was Buddha's main discipline, so they focused on it. And the last thing I'll mention, and then I'll close, is missionary zeal. Missionary zeal. No, not the zeal to go out and convert people, not to go out and convert people, but we need that missionary zeal that the Christians and Muslims have, but on a broad basis of love for all. Again, not to convert people, not to change people, not to make people do things the way that I do them, but the zeal for service, the zeal for service. In our order now, this is an admission from the inside of the order. It's very difficult to find swamis and brahmacharyas who are willing to go to tribal areas. Very difficult to find. They want to be in cultured areas where they're devotees and where they can speak their own language and so forth. In Christianity, you find that there's always a wealth of people who are ready to go into far remote areas and to spend their whole life there, giving up their own society, giving up their own language and everything. So that idea of sacrificing for the welfare of others and delighting in the ways of others. Yes, we should not do it with the idea of conversion. We should not do it with a narrow philosophy, a narrow theology. But we can do the same thing with a love for service, with a love for humanity. I remember Swami Nityaswarupananda, a great Swami of our order and disciple of Holy Mother. I took him to see many things in San Diego when he was 90 years old. He became 90 on the day he arrived in San Diego and stayed with me for 5 days. So I would take him around, show him things. And after showing him many things over the days, the last day we were to go out before he was to return to go up to Trabuco and then Hollywood to leave. I took him to Mount Soledad, which is right on the dividing line between San Diego City and La Jolla, the suburb. It's a single mountain, quite dramatic, right on the ocean. And so you can drive right up to the top of it. And I just thought, you give him a good view, and you can see Mexico from there, and you can see the surrounding area and the mountains to the east and everything. And so that is a nice viewpoint. And so I get there, and I was amazed. He gets out of the car, and he walks around on the top. There's a big flat area on the top with the parking lot, all of that. He starts walking around and saying, now you have brought me somewhere. Now you have shown me something. Now you have really shown me something. Ah, from here you can see the whole world. I had told him, here is Mexico. I said, yes, there is Mexico. And over there is China with its grand ancient civilization. And then Japan before it. And to the south is South America and the grand Native American civilizations. And here is Europe over to this side. Of course, you couldn't see it, but in his imagination he was seeing it. Here is Europe to this side. With the great European civilizations, and then the wonderful continent of Africa with all the different peoples and their civilizations, and then India over there. And he was like in a state of ecstasy, just seeing the whole world from this standpoint. So that was a wonderful thing to me. It really spiritualized the whole experience to me, that he was seeing the greatness of all of the civilizations of the world, all of the peoples of the world. Reaching out in a vision of love towards all, and an acceptance of all, and an interest in all, and a supportive vision of all. So I'll close here just by saying that the life of Christ has its own special appeal, just as the life of Sri Ram does, Sri Krishna does, Sri Chaitanya, Sri Ramakrishna, Buddha. The Sikh gurus, the great Sikh gurus, the Jain Tirthankaras and the sages of Jainism and the sages of other traditions. And so I invoke the blessings of all of the great teachers, including Jesus, on all of us, that we may progress on the spiritual path, which all of these great masters have bequeathed to us. So now I've already gone way over time, so I won't ask for questions now. I'll just give a closing chant and then I'll give announcements. Om Dyo Shanti Antariksham Shanti Prithivi Shanti Apa Shanti Oshadaya Shanti Vanaspataya Shanti Vishwe Deva Shanti Brahma Shanti Sarvam Shanti Shantireva Shanti Sama Shantiredhi Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace is in the heavens. Peace is in the sky. Peace is on earth. Peace is in the waters. Peace in the plants and the trees. The gods are peaceful. Peace is the nature of truth. All is peace. Peace alone, peace. May that peace, real peace, be with us all. Oh, peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe. So, for announcements,